The world narrowed to a single point of white-hot agony in his abdomen. One moment, the air was a chaotic symphony of shattering glass, splintered wood, and the percussive rhythm of gunfire. The next, all sound was muffled by the roaring in his own ears as he stumbled back, his hand flying to the blossoming warmth spreading through the fine fabric of his suit. The pain was a physical thing, a jagged-edged monster tearing through him, but it was the other sensation, the insidious, dizzying heat that followed, that sent a jolt of pure terror through his soul. It was a warmth that had nothing to do with blood loss and everything to do with a life built on a foundation of lies. The complex cocktail of powerful inhibitors he swallowed every single morning, the bitter taste of his cage, was failing. After 24 years of perfect, meticulous control, the fortress he had built around his own biology was crumbling under the shock of a single bullet. A wave of suffocating heat washed over him, and with it came a scent he hadn't allowed himself to truly smell since childhood. It was a cloying, intoxicating sweetness that felt like a violation, a betrayal erupting from his own paws. Honeyed wildflowers and the rich, damp perfume of freshly turned earth. It was potent, undeniable, and utterly, catastrophically Omega. The gunfight, which had been a maelstrom of violence seconds before, faltered. Men on both sides, their bodies coiled in the midst of life-or-death combat, froze. Their heads snapped up, nostrils flaring as their alpha instincts, primitive and powerful, reacted to the impossible scent flooding the room. The air, thick with cordite and blood, was now saturated with the signal of an omega in the throes of a forced, traumatic heat. Across the room, Adriano Morti, the very man he was supposed to be negotiating a fragile peace with, stood like a statue carved from rage. His knuckles were white around the grip of his pistol, his face a mask of primal fury. But then his eyes, dark and predatory, found Luciano. They widened first in sheer disbelief, then with a dawning, terrifying fascination. The untamed scent of cedar and spice that always clung to Adriano intensified, a flare of possessive, instinctual response. He was staring at Luciano not as a rival, not as the Bianchi heir, but as something else entirely. Something he had never known Luciano to be. Slumped against the wreckage of the mahogany table, the world spinning in a nauseating vortex, Luciano Bianchi understood with devastating clarity. His secret, the central pillar of his entire existence, had just been shattered in the most public and violent way imaginable. He was exposed, bleeding, and in heat, in a room full of enemy alphas. This wasn't just the end of a lie, it was a declaration of war. To understand how a single bullet could unravel an empire, you have to understand the lie that Luciano Bianchi had been forced to embody since birth. He moved through the sprawling, opulent Bianchi family compound not as a man, but as a meticulously crafted illusion. The crisp lines of his $1,000 suits, the perfect arrangement of his dark hair, the cool, measured cadence of his voice euros, it was all part of an elaborate performance. To the world, and to the sprawling criminal underworld his family commanded, he was Luciano Bianchi, the Don Euro's trade's only child, the calm and capable beater heir, destined to inherit one of the most ruthless mafia empires in Italy. He was safe, unremarkable in his biology, and therefore untouchable. His father, Don Vittorio Bianchi, was a man who seemed sculpted from cold ambition and unyielding control. His reputation was a fearsome tapestry woven from threads of blood and fear. And Vittorio had been the architect of his son Euro's trade's public identity, designing it with the precision of a master strategist. In their world, a world where bloodlines were currency and biology was a weapon, an Omega son was a liability. A weakness to be exploited, a pawn to be traded, a body to be used for breeding and forging unwanted alliances. A beater, however, was neutral ground. A beater heir could not be manipulated by pheromones, could not be forced into a breeding contract, could not be used to weaken the family from within. A beater heir was a statement of sterile, untouchable power. But beneath the starched collars and the carefully applied scent-masking colognes, a dangerous truth pulsed with a life of its own. Luciano was not a beater. He was an Omega, and a remarkably rare one at that. He descended from a lineage spoken of only in hushed, fearful whispers. A line known for its staggering fertility and a strange, almost hypnotic influence over even the most dominant of alphas. This secret was a loaded gun he held to his own head every single day. His heats, the cyclical torment of his biology, were brutally suppressed by a daily regimen of inhibitors that scoured his throat with a taste of chemicals and stole the very essence of his freedom. His true scent, when it threatened to escape its chemical prison, was smothered by expensive fragrances designed to project nothing at a void, a neutral aura that raised no questions. The day his world ended had begun with the suffocating tension of a high-stakes meeting. An alliance with a Morty syndicate, a rival family with whom the Bianches shared a long and bloody history, was being negotiated. It was an uneasy peace, always one wrong word away from erupting into open warfare. Luciano had taken his seat at the long, polished table, his gaze sharp, his mind a steel trap, analyzing every flicker of movement, every subtle shift in tone. Opposite him sat Adriano Morty, the alpha heir to the Morty throne, a man who was the living embodiment of everything Luciano disdained. Adriano was all raw power and barely concealed aggression, a storm front of a man whose reputation for brutal efficiency preceded him. Where Luciano valued subtlety and cunning, Adriano valued force. His scent, a sharp and aggressive blend of wild cedar and hot spice, was a physical pressure against Luciano's trade's carefully maintained defenses, stirring a primal, unwelcome flicker deep in his gut that he had spent his life learning to ignore. The negotiation itself was a predictable, tedious affair, a chess game of veiled threats and hollow pleasantries. The official topic was a territorial dispute over shipping access at the ports, but the real agenda was a raw test of dominance between two powerful families. Luciano, as always, held his own. His voice was a calm, level instrument, his logic a sharp blade that deftly parried Adriano's more aggressive verbal thrusts. He met the Alpha trade's posturing with cool, intellectual disdain that he could see was slowly driving the other man to the edge of his patience. And then, the heavy oak doors of the meeting room had exploded inwards, and the fragile peace had been annihilated by a hail of bullets. The chaos was instantaneous, and in that moment, instinct took over. Years of relentless training guided his movements as he dropped, rolling behind the heavy table and drawing the Sig Sauer that was a permanent fixture beneath his jacket. This was no random attack, it was a targeted, professional hit. He fired with deadly precision, his mind cold and clear, taking down a masked assailant who was advancing on his father. He could hear Adriano's trade's guttural roars of fury from the other side of the room as the Alpha became a whirlwind of lethal violence. But even as he fought, a single thought screamed through his mind: who had betrayed them? Who knew about this meeting? And then the bullet had found him, and all his questions had dissolved into agony and the horrifying, sweet scent of his own undoing. The aftermath was a blur of panicked shouts, the sting of antiseptics, and the suffocating taste of shame. Luciano was rushed from the bloody scene, his wound hastily patched up by the Bianchi family Eurostrade's private physician, Dr. Rossi, a grim-faced beater who had been a silent accomplice in Luciano Eurostrade's lifelong deception for years. The doctor administered an emergency dose of even stronger suppressants, but the fire, once unleashed, refused to be contained. Luciano thrashed in the silk sheets of his bed, his body slick with sweat, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. The deep, raw ache in his core was a constant, humiliating throb, a physical manifestation of his botter Eurostrade's profound betrayal. Don Vittorio stood over his bed, his face a thunderous mask of cold fury. "This changes everything," his father Eurostrade's voice rumbled, low and laced with a terrifying danger. "They know, Luciano. The Mortis were in that room. The entire underworld will know by morning." All Luciano could do was grit his teeth, his hands clenching into fists against the fine linen. The news would spread like a plague. The untouchable Bianchi heir, an Omater, a powerful, fertile Omater from a near-mythical bloodline. His secret wasn't just a personal matter anymore. It was a strategic vulnerability, a priceless weapon that had just fallen into the hands of their enemies. Within days, the whispers became a roar. The revelation sent shockwaves through the intricate network of the criminal underworld. Speculation was rampant. Who had orchestrated the hit? Was it a calculated move specifically designed to expose Luciano? And how would the formidable Don Bianchi respond to such a catastrophic blow to his family's prestige? The answer, when it came, was not delivered with a volley of gunfire, but with the cold, chilling logic of a business transaction. Don Vittorio, ever the pragmatist, saw only one path forward. He initiated contact with the Morty Syndicate. Luciano, still weak from his wound and the ongoing war against his own biology, was summoned to his father's imposing study. He entered to find Don Vittorio seated behind his massive desk, his expression as unreadable as carved stone. But it was the other man in the room that made a cold dread coil in Luciano's stomach. Adriano Morti stood there, rigid and imposing, flanked by two of his most trusted alphas. The usual overwhelming dominance of Adriano Eurostrade's scent was strangely muted, tinged with an unfamiliar note of uncertainty. His dark eyes flickered towards Luciano, and in their depths, Luciano saw a disturbing cocktail of emotions. Grudging respect for his performance in the firefight, and something else, something darker and more primal that made his skin crawl. "We have come to an arrangement," Don Vittorio announced, his voice utterly devoid of emotion, "to prevent a full-scale war that would cripple both our families, and to secure a stable future. A union has been proposed." Luciano felt the blood drain from his face. He knew with a sickening certainty what was coming. The air in the room was thick with the unspoken clash of two powerful alpha bloodlines, and beneath it all, his own suppressed scent fought to be free, a traitor within his own skin. "You will be married to Adriano Morti," his father declared, and the words fell like a death sentence. Luciano Eurostrade's breath caught in his throat. He stared, speechless, from his father to Adriano, his mind reeling in disbelief. Married to him, to the brutish, unsubtle alpha who represented everything he despised, to the heir of the very family he suspected of orchestrating the attack that had nearly killed him and had utterly destroyed his life. Adriano, for his part, looked as though he'd just been forced to swallow poison. His jaw was clenched so tight a muscle jumped violently in his temple. Luciano knew the rumors. Adriano had no desire for an Omega consort, let alone one from a rival family, and especially not one from a bloodline whispered to hold a strange, instinctual power over Alphas. But to refuse would mean a catastrophic loss of face, and it would plunge their families into a devastating war that neither side could truly afford to win. No, Luciano heard himself say the word, a raw, desperate whisper. He found his strength, his voice growing louder, laced with a defiance he hadn't realized he still possessed. No, I refuse. I will not. Don Vittorio Eurostrade's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. You will, Luciano. This is for the family. This is not a choice. It is a command. The wedding will take place in 3 weeks. A surge of primal, ungastic anger, an instinct to resist being controlled, to resist being treated as property, rose up in him. He would not be a pawn in their games. He would not be a sacrifice on the altar of their ambition. But as he looked at the resolute granite of his father's jaw, and the grim, trapped acceptance in Adriano's dark eyes, he knew it was futile. This was not a negotiation. It was a decree. His gaze locked with Adriano's across the vast, silent expanse of the study, and a silent, bitter promise passed between them. This would not be a marriage. It would be a battlefield. The 3 weeks leading up to the ceremony were a unique form of torment, a purgatory of forced politeness and simmering, unspoken hatred. The news of the impending union sent a second, more powerful shockwave through the underworld. It was an unprecedented alliance, a truce forged in the crucible of bloodshed and cold, political necessity. Luciano felt utterly trapped, his life now confined to a gilded cage, built to prevent a war but constructed from the shattered pieces of his own autonomy. He did, however, negotiate his own terms with his father, delivering them with a chilling calm that seemed to shake even the stoic Don. I will never submit to him, he stated, his voice like ice. I will never allow him to bond with me, and I will never, ever love him. His father, surprisingly, had relayed these terms to the Mortis, and to Luciano Eurostrade's astonishment, they had agreed. It seemed Adriano was just as unwilling to form a genuine bond as he was. This was to be a marriage in name only, a cold business arrangement secured by vows as thin as paper. Adriano began to make perfunctory, mandated visits to the Bianchi compound, a charade of courtship for the benefit of watching eyes. Their interactions were as stiff and awkward as a poorly rehearsed play, punctuated by Luciano's biting sarcasm and Adriano Eurostrade's grim, brooding silence. Luciano clung to his bitter facade with a desperate ferocity, his suppressants working overtime, his scent meticulously masked under layers of neutral cologne. He refused to show a single crack in his armor, knowing that a man as ruthless as Adriano would exploit any sign of vulnerability without a momentary Eurostrade's hesitation. One afternoon, Adriano found him in the vast, silent Bianchi family library, a room that smelled of old leather and the ghosts of powerful men. Luciano was hunched over antique ledgers, his mind lost in the complex intricacies of the family's legitimate business holdings, a world of numbers and logic where he felt a semblance of control. Pretending you're still useful. Adriano Eurostrade's rough voice broke the silence, a deliberate provocation. Luciano didn't bother to look up from his work. Unlike some people, I believe in understanding the mechanisms of power, not just swinging it around like a club. Adriano let out a short, derisive scoff. You think you're so clever, don't you, Omega? Hiding behind your books and your pretty, cutting words. Finally, Luciano lifted his head, his eyes as cold and gray as a winter sea. I think I am smarter than you, Alpha, and I am certainly less predictable. You are a blunt instrument, Morty. Effective in your own way, perhaps, but easily dodged by anyone with a brain. Adrianore's scent flared, a sudden, sharp spike of aggression that thickened the air. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, towering over Lucianore's seated form. "Be careful, Bianchi," he growled. "Your insolence is going to earn you a lesson you won't forget." "Is that a threat, my future husband?" Luciano countered, his voice remarkably steady despite the flicker of primal fear that tightened his stomach. He was deliberately provoking a dominant alpha, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to submit, to look away. But he would not. He could not. Adrianore's dark gaze dropped from Luciano's eyes to his throat, then traveled lower, lingering for a moment on the line of his hips with insulting deliberation. "Eater Euro's a reminder of your place. You may have convinced your father to agree to your little terms, but biology doesn't give a damn about politics. And when I'm pushed, neither do I." A fresh wave of shame and fury washed over Luciano. Adriano was talking about his heats, about the inevitable cycles that would one day overwhelm his suppressants and leave him helpless. "You will find me far more difficult to break than you imagine." Luciano spat, his voice laced with venom. "We'll see about that," Adriano murmured, a predatory glint in his eye, before turning on his heel and leaving the library in a storm of silent fury. Luciano watched him go, his heart hammering against his ribs. The war had officially begun. The wedding day was a grotesque spectacle of opulence and barely concealed hostility. The ceremony took place in a historic villa rented for the occasion. Its grand halls swathed in white silk and overflowing with so many fragrant flowers that the air was thick and cloying. A sickeningly sweet perfume attempting to mask the venomous undercurrents pulsing beneath the surface. The guest list was a veritable war. Who of the criminal elite, 2 powerful families and their allies, all gathered to witness a union that bound them together in mutual distrust. Luciano wore a custom-tailored white suit, the exquisite fabric and sharp lines designed to conceal the subtle softening of his frame that not even his rigorous training could completely prevent. He walked down the long aisle not with the joy of a groom, but with the grim, resolute determination of a man marching toward his own execution. His father, Don Vittorio, was a stone-faced sentinel at his side, his expression unreadable. Adriano waited at the altar, a dark, formidable presence in his black suit, his own gaze as impassive as his father-in-law's. His normally overpowering alpha scent was tightly restrained, a testament to his own profound discomfort with the entire proceeding. The ceremony was mercifully brief, conducted by a priest with trembling hands who seemed to rush through the sacred vows as if he feared the unholy union might cause the chapel walls to crumble. When the time came to exchange rings, Lucianore's hand shook almost imperceptibly as Adriano slid a heavy, cold band of gold onto his finger. He forced himself to reciprocate, the chilling touch of the metal a physical manifestation of their frigid contract. There was no kiss. There was no embrace. There was only a strained, deafening silence that spoke more loudly than any vow. The reception was a nightmare of forced smiles and hollow congratulations. Luciano moved through the glittering crowd like a phantom, his face a mask of polite indifference, while his mind raced. His eyes constantly scanned the room, searching for a face that didn't belong, a glance that lingered too long. Any sign of the traitor his instincts screamed was still lurking in the shadows. He suspected someone in Adriano's family, of course. Who else stood to gain so much from his exposure? As the night dragged on, Luciano found himself cornered by a group of older Alphers, allies of the Mortys. Their gazes lingered on him with a leering, unsettling curiosity. One of them, a grizzled Don named Salvatore, let out a crude chuckle. So, the famous Bianchi heir is really an Omega. Who would have thought? A pretty little thing, too. Such a waste that you're already off the market. A cold, quiet fury began to simmer beneath Luciano's skin. He met Salvatore's mocking gaze with an icy stare. I am the Bianchi heir, Don Salvatore, and I am a husband. My status as an Omega has not diminished my capabilities in the slightest. Salvatore roared with dismissive laughter. Capabilities? An Omega's capabilities are very specific, boy. And most of them involve warming in Alvar's bed and bearing his children. Before Luciano could formulate a suitably cutting response, Adriano was suddenly there, his imposing presence scattering the smaller group like a wolf among sheep. His scent flared, a clear and potent. Don Salvatore, Adriano said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. My husband's biology is not our topic for public discussion. I suggest you remember your place before I am forced to remind you of it. The older Don blanched, clearly shocked by Adriano's swift and aggressive intervention. He mumbled a hasty apology and retreated back into the crowd. Luciano stared at Adriano, a flicker of genuine surprise in his eyes. He had expected his new husband to be indifferent, or perhaps even silently agree with Salvatore's crude sentiments. Protecting your new property, Morty? Luciano asked, his voice laced with cynical skepticism. Adriano's gaze was hard as flint. You are my consort now. An insult to you is an insult to me, and by extension, to the Morty family. Do not for 1 second mistake my actions for anything other than strategic necessity. Luciano let out a short, humorless laugh. Of course, strategic necessity, because that's all this is, isn't it? A strategy. Adriano's eyes held his, and for a fleeting, unsettling moment, something unreadable passed between Themer Euros, a shared, silent acknowledgement of the bars of the cage they both now inhabited. Later that night, Luciano was escorted to his assigned room in the sprawling Morty mansion. It was a luxurious, impeccably decorated space, but it felt as cold and impersonal as a high-end hotel room. The heavy door clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing with the finality of his new reality. He was married. He was trapped. He was exposed. He tore off the white wedding suit, the expensive fabric feeling like a suffocating shroud against his skin. He caught his reflection in the large, ornate mirror, Euros, a pale, haunted stranger staring back at him. The lie he had lived for 24 years was over. Now, the battle for who he truly was had just begun. The initial days inside the Morty mansion were a silent, relentless war of wills. Luciano drifted through the opulent, echoing rooms like a ghost, his every nerve ending alight, attuned to the subtle shifts in the atmosphere, the thick undercurrents of suspicion that permeated the very air he breathed. He was a prisoner in all but name, the lavish surroundings nothing more than a beautifully decorated cage. Adriano, for his part, was a silent, brooding shadow, a constant, oppressive presence. Their few interactions were clipped and brutally formal, every word weighed down with unspoken accusations. The entire Morty household, a staff comprised entirely of alphers and beaters, watched him with a discomfiting blend of curiosity and poorly concealed resentment. He met their stares with his own carefully constructed mask of cold indifference, retreating to his rooms to immerse himself in books on economics and military history. seeking solace in facts and figures, anything to distract him from the unsettling awareness of Adriano Eurostrade's dominant alpha scent that seemed to have seeped into the very walls of the mansion. It was a constant, low-level pressure against his mental barriers, forcing his suppressants to work harder and making his own body hum with a quiet, rebellious energy. His father Eurostrade's daily phone calls were brief and transactional. "The truce is holding," Don Vittorio would state, his tone as detached as if he were reading a stock report. "Maintain appearances. Give them no reason to provoke you." "And the leak?" Luciano pressed one evening, his voice low. "The ambush. We need to know who knew." His father's voice hardened. "We are investigating on our end. You will do the same on yours." Luciano understood the unspoken command perfectly. He was to be a spy in his own marriage, to watch Adriano, to probe the Morty defenses, to uncover the traitor who had so thoroughly destroyed his life. The bitter irony was not lost on him. Adriano was almost certainly doing the exact same thing. One evening, while heading to the study to retrieve a book, Luciano overheard voices drifting from the open doorway of Adriano's private office. He paused, concealed by the shadows of the hallway. "Still can't believe your father agreed to this," a gruff voice Adriano's Cancelliere Marco Euros was saying. "An Omega Heir. What a risk, Don Adriano. What if he's a plant? A Trojan horse sent by Vittorio to cripple us from within?" Adriano's response was a low growl. "He's not a plant, Marco. That attack was too real." His fear, the center Euros, it was genuine, but that doesn't mean he isn't dangerous. Vittorio Bianchi plays the long game. The real question is who benefited most from exposing him, us, or a third party who wanted to force a war between us. Luciano froze, his heart turning to a lump of ice in his chest. They suspected him. It was a logical, if infuriating, conclusion. He strained to hear more, but the heavy office door clicked shut, cutting off the conversation. That overheard exchange solidified Luciano's resolve. He wasn't just fighting for his autonomy anymore, he was fighting for his life. He had to find the real traitor, not only to prove his innocence to the Mortys, but to protect himself from whatever unseen enemy was pulling their strings. He began to subtly probe the household, observing the staff, listening to hushed conversations, his mind a labyrinth of suspicions and deductions. He paid particular attention to Alessandro, Adriano's ambitious cousin, a man who always seemed to be lurking in the periphery with sharp, calculating eyes. Rumor had it that Alessandro chafed under Adriano's rule and coveted the Don's position for himself. A war, or even a destabilized alliance, could create the chaos he needed to make his move. Amidst this new, alien environment, Luciano Eurostrade's only comfort was a fragile link to his past, his encrypted calls with Emilia. She was a kind, bitter woman who had been his caretaker since he was a child, one of the very few people in the world who knew his true nature. She had been the one to meticulously help him manage his suppressants, his secret, his entire double life. Her familiar, raspy voice was a balm to his frayed nerves. "How are you holding up, my boy?" she had asked during one of their calls, her voice thick with worry. "Are they treating you with respect?" "As much respect as one can expect for a hostage," Luciano replied, a wry, bitter twist to his lips. "It's a Euros tense here, Emilia. The air is thick with distrust. I need a favor. I need you to discreetly look into the security protocols at our compound on the night of the ambush. See if anything was compromised from our side. Any new personnel, anyone who seemed suspicious. Of course, Caro, Emilia had promised, her voice unwavering. You just be safe, my Omega. My heart aches for you. That conversation, a precious sliver of connection to his old life, was a lifeline in a stormy sea. He had no way of knowing it would be their last. 3 days later, the world shattered for a second time. Don Vittorio called, his voice clipped and strained, stripped of its usual iron control. Emilia, his father said, and the way he spoke her name sent a chilling premonition through Luciano's entire body. She's dead. They found her this morning. She was stabbed. The room tilted violently on its axis. Emilia, Luciano echoed, his own voice hollow and distant, as if it belonged to someone else. No, that's impossible. Was €8 a robbery? Nothing was taken, Don Vittorio replied, his voice heavy with grim certainty. It was a targeted assassination, either a message or an attempt to tie up loose ends. A cold, suffocating dread spread through Luciano's chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. Loose ends. Emilia knew his secret. She was instrumental in maintaining the elaborate lie. Her murder, coming so soon after his exposure, could not possibly be a coincidence. It was a brutal, unequivocal. Who? Luciano demanded, his voice trembling with a raw, unfamiliar emotion. Who would do this to her? We don't know, his father admitted, and the admission of ignorance from Don Vittorio was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all. But this confirms it. There is a rat in our midst, and they are systematically eliminating anyone who knows too much. Luciano ended the call, his hand shaking so badly he could barely place the receiver back in its cradle. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, hot and sharp, but he brutally forced them back. Grief was a luxury he could not afford. Not now. Emilia, his kind, loyal Emilia, who had been more of a mother to him than his own, was dead. And it was because of him, because of his secret. His mind, even in its anguish, began to race, cold and calculating. Who knew that Emilia was one of the few aware of his Omega status? Only a handful of people in the Bianchi's inner circle. And now, by extension, the Mortis knew of her role as his longtime caretaker. His suspicion, sharp and immediate, turned to Adriano. He had just tasked Emilia with investigating the ambush from the Bianchi side. Had their encrypted conversation been intercepted? Had Adriano, through his own network of spies, discovered Emilia's proximity to the secret and had her silenced to prevent her from uncovering the truth? Or worse, had he killed her to frame Luciano and further cement the theory that he was the traitor? Fueled by a new, righteous fury, Luciano sought Adriano out, finding him in his study, poring over documents. He didn't bother with greetings or pleasantries. Emilia is dead. Adriano looked up, his expression a mask of stone, but Luciano caught the subtle flicker in his eyes that told him this was not news. I heard, Adriano said, his voice flat. She was murdered, Luciano pressed, his voice tight with controlled rage. She was one of the only people who knew my secret. She helped me manage the suppressants for years. Adriano's jaw tightened. And you think I ordered it? He asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Did you? Luciano challenged, meeting the Alpha's gaze head-on, refusing to be the one to look away. It would certainly be convenient for you. One less person who could contradict your pet theory about me being a plant. Adriano shoved himself away from the desk, rising to his full, intimidating height. His Alpha scent flared, a potent wave of anger and something else Luciano couldn't quite placer Yoro's offense, perhaps. You think I would stoop to murdering a helpless old woman? My family may be ruthless, Bianchi, but we do not murder innocents. That is not our way. Your family orchestrates ambushes at neutral peace talks, Morty," Luciano shot back, bitterness lacing every word. "And now the woman who raised me is dead. Forgive me if I don't take your word for it." Adriano took a step closer, his eyes hard as diamonds. "And who am I supposed to trust? Omega, an Omega heir who magically appears out of nowhere, right before a major hit on his own family. How incredibly convenient. Perhaps Emilia was your accomplice. Perhaps she was feeding information to an outside party, and you had her silenced when she got cold feet. Perhaps you are the rat." The accusation was a physical blow, stinging and infuriating. "You think I would kill the only mother I've ever known?" Luciano scoffed, the disbelief in his voice raw and palpable. "You truly are a soulless brute, Morty. And you are a manipulative schemer, Bianchi," Adriano retorted, his own voice rising to match Luciano's. "This is not our game. Someone is actively trying to destroy both of our families. And the more time we spend pointing fingers at each other, the easier we make it for them to succeed." He had a point, a horribly logical point that grated on Luciano's last nerve. The possibility of a third party, an unknown player manipulating them both, was a terrifying one. But the immediate, visceral pain of Emilia's death and the lifetime of secrecy that had been shattered made trust an impossible concept. "I will find out who did this," Luciano vowed, his voice low and fierce. "And when I do, I will make them pay. And if the trail leads back to you, Morty, know that this sham of a marriage will not be enough to protect you." Adriano's dark gaze held his, and for a long, charged moment, the air in the room crackled with their shared suspicion and unspoken threats. The marriage was a fragile truce built on a foundation of quicksand, and a storm was coming. The weeks that followed Emilia's murder were a torturous existence, a slow dance of silent grief and escalating paranoia. Luciano mourned in the solitary confinement of his own mind, the pain a private, searing wound. He channeled his anguish into his investigation, throwing himself into the work with a feverish intensity. He examined every financial ledger, every intercepted communication, every security report from both the Bianchi and Morty operations, searching for the phantom thread that he knew must connect the ambush to Emilia Eurostrade's death. His mind, always sharp, became a weapon, sifting through mountains of data, identifying patterns and inconsistencies that others had missed. His interactions with Adriano remained as brittle as glass, marked by a tension so thick it felt like a physical presence in every room they shared. They communicated almost exclusively through their respective carpos, or in brief, formal meetings where every word was a carefully chosen chess piece. The constant, unrelenting stress, coupled with the subtle but persistent influence of Adriano Eurostrade's dominant alpha scent permeating his living space, began to take a serious toll on the effectiveness of his suppressants. Luciano started to notice small, terrifying changes, a heightened sensitivity to smells, a fleeting, unfamiliar warmth that would blossom deep in his core, an almost imperceptible shift in his body's internal rhythm. He quietly doubled his dosage, enduring the punishing side effects: splitting headaches, waves of nausea, and a constant, bone-deep fatigue. He could not allow himself to succumb to a full heat while trapped in the Morty mansion, not in front of Adriano. It would be the ultimate humiliation, the final surrender of control he had fought his entire life to maintain. One evening, while cross-referencing old security logs from the Bianchi compound with known associates of rival families, he found something. A pattern, In the weeks leading up to the ambush, an unusual number of maintenance personnel had been granted access to the compound's secure areas. Some of the names on the visitor logs rang a faint bell, names associated with smaller, peripheral syndicates. Syndicates that had known ties to a powerful and dangerous Eastern European alpha named Don Valerius Volkov. Lucianor Euro's trade's mind clicked into place. Volkov, he was infamous for his sprawling intelligence network, his ruthless efficiency, and his uncanny ability to subtly manipulate weaker families for his own gain. Luciano suddenly remembered his father mentioning, years ago, that Volkov had expressed a strategic interest in an alliance with the Bianchi family. Euro's veiled marriage proposal for Luciano back when the world still believed he was a beater. The thought sent an icy chill down his spine. If Volkov had somehow discovered that Luciano was an Umbar Euros, he pushed the thought away. It was a theory, nothing more. He needed concrete proof. But the seed of suspicion had been planted. Meanwhile, Adriano was conducting his own parallel investigation, still half convinced that the traitor was someone within Luciano's own circle. He had his men discreetly tailing members of Luciano Euro's trade's personal staff, hoping to uncover a loose tongue or a clandestine meeting. Yet, his gaze often lingered on Luciano himself, and the suspicion in his eyes was now mingled with a strange, grudging respect. He saw the cold, brilliant intellect at work. He saw the relentless drive, and he couldn't ignore the quiet, profound grief that still shadowed Luciano's eyes. This Omega was unlike any he had ever imagined. Euros frustratingly defiant, maddeningly competent, and utterly unbreakable. One afternoon, during a tense dinner with Adriano and his inner circle, the conversation turned to a minor territory dispute with a volatile independent crew. Luciano, who had been sitting in stoic silence, suddenly offered a sharp, incisive tactical assessment of the situation that completely blindsided Adriano's seasoned Carpos. His analysis was flawless, identifying weaknesses in their opponent's strategy and proposing potential countermoves that no one else in the room had considered. As he spoke, a stunned silence fell over the table. The other men stared at him, their expressions a mixture of shock and newfound respect. In that moment, he was not an Omega, not a political prisoner, but a brilliant strategist, the true heir of the Bianchi Empire. Adriano watched him, a complex, unreadable expression on his face. The fragile truce between them was built on a lie, but perhaps, just perhaps, they had found a common enemy. And in the dark, bloody world they inhabited, sometimes a shared enemy was the strongest foundation of all. They are husbands in name only, two kings of rival empires bound by a vow they both resent. They are trapped in a gilded cage, surrounded by enemies on all sides, and still unsure if the greatest threat is the one plotting against them from the outside, or the man sleeping in the room down the hall. Their war has been put on hold, replaced by a fragile, suspicious alliance against an unseen puppeteer who wants to see both their families burn. What do you think will happen next? Will they manage to trust each other enough to uncover the real traitor? And who do you think is pulling the strings? A circumflex Euros, the ambitious cousin Alessandro, the shadowy Don Volkov, or is there another player we haven't even met yet? Let me know all of your theories in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story and want to see what happens in their battle for survival, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more.